Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. We love to dig in deep into a topic, and today we're diving into the work of Jonathan Cahn.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard of him?
Yes, definitely.
So he is a Messianic Jewish pastor and author, and he's probably most famous for his book, The Harbinger. And it's all about connecting ancient Israel to modern-day America. And it's really resonated with a lot of people, but it's also caused a lot of controversy, particularly among scholars and theologians.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people who study biblical prophecy and biblical interpretation,
Right.
yeah, they have some serious concerns about his work, so it should be interesting.
Yeah, it should be, and I'm excited to kind of unpack all of that with you. So why don't we start with just giving our listeners a little bit of background on Jonathan Cahn and his work, for those who might not be familiar with him.
Sure. So Jonathan Cahn comes from a Messianic Jewish background.
Okay?
And just to kind of unpack that a little bit, Messianic Judaism is a faith that blends Jewish tradition with the belief that Jesus or Yeshua is the Messiah.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a both and kind of perspective.
Yeah, so they're not saying that one replaces the other.
Right. It's this idea that both can coexist together. And so that really influences how he interprets both the Old and New Testaments. He's looking for connections between what happened in ancient Israel and what's happening in the world today, particularly in America.
I see. So he's kind of looking for these patterns.
Exactly. And that's where some of the controversy comes in. He sees these patterns of judgment and warning from ancient Israel repeating themselves in modern America. And he's not afraid to make predictions based on these patterns.
Wow.
Which, yeah, some people find that really compelling and other people have some serious questions about that.
Right. So bold claims are being made, and as we mentioned earlier, those claims have been met with quite a bit of criticism. What are some of the main concerns that scholars and critics have raised about Kahn's work?
Well, there are a lot of different criticisms, but they sort of fall into these different categories. We have factual errors,
Okay.
logical errors, hermeneutical errors, epistemological errors, and even cognitive biases.
Wow, that is quite a list. So we're going to have to break all of this down
Yes.
carefully. And I know you've been doing a lot of research on this. You've been looking at a lot of sources that analyze Jonathan Cahn's work. What are some of the key takeaways that you found?
Well, one really helpful piece is called Debunking Jonathan Cahn,
Okay,
and it really breaks down these errors in detail and gives specific examples.
perfect. I think we should start with those factual errors. So what kind of inaccuracies are we talking about here? What are some examples?
Okay, so one example is Cahn uses Isaiah 9:10, which is a verse about ancient Israel rebuilding after destruction,
Okay.
to draw parallels to the 9/11 attacks and the rebuilding of the World Trade Center.
It seems like a bit of a stretch, like taking a verse from the Old Testament about a very specific historical event
Right.
and applying it to something like 9/11.
Yeah, and that's the critique. A lot of biblical scholars would say that that's a misinterpretation of the verse because it needs to be understood in its historical context.
All right.
So Kahn's critics would say that he's taking verses out of context to fit his narrative.
Gotcha. So context is key. And what about some of the other potential factual errors? What about his interpretation of the Shemitah cycle?
Right, so Cahn claims that the Shemitah, which is an ancient Jewish practice of letting the land lie fallow every 7 years and forgiving debts, is directly tied to modern economic cycles.
Okay.
So he suggests that like every 7 years, we're due for an economic collapse.
So that's a pretty bold claim. I mean, is there any evidence to support that?
That's the thing critics would point out, that there's really no historical evidence to back up that connection. While economic cycles certainly exist, attributing them to this ancient practice like the Shemitah requires a lot more concrete evidence.
Right. So it seems like he's making these connections between events that may not actually be connected at all. But we've also got those logical errors to consider. Can you give us an example of what some of those logical errors look like?
Sure. So remember that claim about America following the same path as ancient Israel,
Yes.
and therefore headed for judgment? That's a classic example of a logical fallacy called a non sequitur.
Okay.
So just because something happened to ancient Israel, it doesn't automatically mean the same thing will happen to America.
Okay. So the logic isn't really there.
Right. The circumstances are totally different. It's like saying, because my grandfather fell off a ladder and broke his leg, I'm also destined to fall off a ladder and break my leg.
Right. So the situations aren't really comparable.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. It's easy to see how that kind of faulty logic can lead to some questionable conclusions. But we've also got those hermeneutical errors to consider. For our listeners who might not be theology majors, could you break down what a hermeneutical error is?
Yeah, so hermeneutics is basically the art and science of interpreting texts, especially biblical texts.
Okay.
And one of the criticisms of Kahn's work is that he commits something called eisegesis.
Eisegesis. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a big word, but it essentially means reading your own ideas into the text instead of drawing the meaning out of the text.
Okay.
So it's the opposite of exegesis, which is carefully studying the text to understand its original meaning.
So it's like approaching the text with a predetermined conclusion and then looking for evidence to support it rather than letting the text speak for itself.
Exactly. And that's one of the criticisms of Cahn's approach. Critics would argue that he starts with the assumption that America is headed for judgment,
Okay.
and then he selectively interprets biblical texts to fit that narrative.
It's like forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, you might be able to make it fit, but it's not going to be a natural fit.
Right. And it highlights the importance of approaching any text, especially sacred text, with humility and a willingness to let the text guide you rather than trying to force it to say what you want it to say.
Hey,
Wow, this is really fascinating. So we've covered factual errors, logical errors, and hermeneutical errors, but we still got those epistemological errors and cognitive biases to unpack. So why don't we take a quick break and then we'll come back and dive into those in part two. And we are back for part two of our deep dive into Jonathan Cahn's work. And before the break, we were getting into some pretty deep theological waters with those factual, logical, and hermeneutical errors. Now we're going even deeper into the world of epistemology and cognitive biases.
that's right. And this is where things get really interesting because we're not just looking at the content of his arguments, but also how he arrives at those conclusions and how our own minds can play tricks on us.
Yeah, I think for a lot of our listeners, the concept of epistemological errors might sound a little intimidating or abstract.
It's a big word.
It is a big word. Can you break that down for us? How does that apply to Cahn's work?
Sure. So epistemology is basically the study of knowledge and truth.
Okay.
It asks questions like, what are the sources of knowledge? How do we know what we know? And how can we be sure that our beliefs are justified?
So it's about how we form our beliefs and how we know if they're actually true.
Exactly. And so when we apply this to Cahn's work, one of the criticisms is that he often presents his personal interpretations and revelations as if they are universally true for everyone.
As if his experience is the truth for everyone.
Right. It's like saying, I had this insight, therefore it must be true for everyone.
Okay, that's interesting. So how can we as listeners navigate that distinction between personal experience and objective truth? I mean, it's one thing to say, I had this powerful experience or I feel really strongly about this. But how do we know if that's actually true for everybody?
That's the million-dollar question. And it really gets to the heart of discernment. Personal experiences and revelations can be incredibly meaningful and valid for the individual,
Right.
but they don't automatically become universal truths.
So just because somebody had an experience or an insight doesn't mean that we should all accept that as the ultimate truth.
Right. And we need to be careful about assuming that someone's subjective experience is somehow proof of an objective truth.
Okay, so are there other examples of these epistemological errors in Cahn's work?
Yeah, another one that comes up is his reliance on allegory and symbolism, particularly in his book, The Harbinger. He sees prophetic significance in events that others might just see as coincidence.
Oh, yeah. Like the cedar tree that was uprooted in a storm, and he tied that to some passage in Isaiah.
Exactly. And, it makes for compelling storytelling.
It does.
But is it sound interpretation?
Right.
That's where it gets tricky because it's one thing to say that God can work through symbolism and natural events.
Right.
But it's another thing to insist that certain events have specific prophetic meanings.
Especially meanings that line up with our interpretation.
Right. And that's the thing with prophecy. It can be so easily molded to fit a certain narrative.
Right, so it's like saying this event happened and it fits this prophecy, therefore my interpretation must be correct.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking can lead us down some pretty rabbit holes.
Absolutely, and it makes me think about confirmation bias, which is one of those cognitive biases that you mentioned earlier. Can you remind our listeners what confirmation bias is and how it might be at play here?
Sure. So confirmation bias is that tendency we all have to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs
Okay.
and to dismiss or downplay information that contradicts our beliefs.
So we're kind of filtering the information to see what we want to see.
Exactly. It's like we're wearing those rose-colored glasses that make everything look rosy even when it's not.
So if Cahn already believes that America is headed for judgment, he's more likely to see things, even random events, as evidence to support that belief.
Absolutely. And he might downplay or even ignored evidence that challenges his perspective.
So it's not necessarily intentional, it's just the way our brains work sometimes.
Right. It's a very human tendency, but it can be very dangerous, especially when we're dealing with something as serious as prophecy and, divine judgment.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are pretty high when you're talking about those things.
Absolutely. And, another cognitive bias that's relevant here is pattern recognition bias.
I've heard of that one, But can you explain how that might be affecting Kahn's interpretations?
Sure, our brains are wired to look for patterns. It's a survival mechanism that helps us make sense of the world.
Right.
But the problem is that sometimes we see patterns even where they don't exist. It's like seeing shapes in the clouds or faces in random objects.
Or, conspiracy theories.
Exactly. And so with prophecy, we might be tempted to connect the dots in ways that confirm our
Even if
expectations.
those connections are totally random.
Right. And the connections may be based more on our desire to see a pattern than on actual evidence.
Yeah, like we're forcing those dots to connect.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases and to be critical thinkers. We need to question our assumptions, especially when we're dealing with things that seem too good to be true or that perfectly align with our existing beliefs.
So what we're seeing with Jonathan Cahn is that his interpretations might be influenced not just by factual errors and logical fallacies, but also by these deeper issues of epistemology and cognitive biases.
Exactly. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating.
It is, and it raises some serious questions about the reliability of his conclusions and his predictions. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious about the overall impact of Kahn's work. What are the implications of his message, especially for those who find his ideas compelling? Welcome back to the deep dive. It's the final part of our look at Jonathan Cahn's work and the criticisms surrounding it.
Yeah, we've really been digging into some pretty complex ideas about prophecy and interpretation and the potential pitfalls of confirmation bias and pattern recognition.
Absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious about one more aspect of Cahn's teachings. We've talked about the potential errors, the biases, but what about the overall impact? What are the implications of his message, especially for those who find his ideas compelling?
But that's a great question, and I think it's important to acknowledge that Kahn's work has resonated with a lot of people.
Oh, definitely.
His books have been bestsellers, and his speaking engagements are very popular. And I think part of that is because he taps into some very real fears and anxieties that people have about the state of the world.
Right.
And, particularly in America.
Yeah, especially given the current climate and the political landscape.
Exactly. So I think it's natural for people to look for answers, to look for meaning in times of uncertainty and turmoil. And Cahn offers a very compelling narrative that seems to explain a lot of what's going on.
Right. And his message is very clear and very direct.
Right.
It's like, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and this is what's going to happen next.
Exactly. And for people who are looking for that kind of certainty, it can be very appealing.
Absolutely. But what are some of the potential downsides or risks associated with accepting Kahn's claims uncritically?
Well, one concern is that his focus on impending judgment and this idea that America is on a predetermined path of decline
Right.
can lead to a sense of fatalism or despair.
I see what you're saying.
If people believe that judgment is inevitable
Okay.
and that nothing can be done to avert it,
Right.
it can be very disempowering.
Right. Because it's like, if it's all going to fall apart anyway, then why bother?
Exactly. And that kind of mindset can prevent people from taking positive action or working towards solution.
Right. It makes me think about the difference between a prophetic voice that warns of potential dangers and calls people to repentance
Right.
versus a voice that simply declares doom and says there's no hope.
Exactly. And I think that distinction is crucial.
Absolutely. And it also makes me think about the potential for fear and anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you're constantly being told that judgment is coming and that things are only going to get worse, that can create a lot of stress and worry.
Absolutely. And, fear is a powerful motivator.
Right.
It can be used to control people or to promote specific agendas.
So instead of empowering people to act, it might actually make them more passive or more susceptible to manipulation.
Exactly. And that's something to be really aware of.
Absolutely. And another concern I have is that Kahn's emphasis on America's unique role in prophecy and, the potential for divine judgment on the nation
Right.
can foster a sense of nationalism or exceptionalism.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that America is somehow special or chosen by God can be very dangerous.
Right, because if you believe that your nation is the only one that matters, then it's easy to dismiss or dehumanize people from other countries.
Exactly. And it goes against the very heart of the Christian message, which is about loving your neighbor as yourself.
Right, and recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human being.
Absolutely.
Wow, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. We've gone from very specific errors in Kahn's work to these much broader implications of his message.
Right.
So I guess the big question is, what do we do with all of this information? How should we approach Kahn's work moving forward?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be discerning. To not just accept things at face value, but to really think critically about what he's saying, to compare it to scripture, to consult other sources.
To do your own research?
Exactly. And I think it's also important to be aware of our own biases and our own tendencies to see what we want to see.
To look for those patterns even where they don't exist.
Right. We all have our own preconceived notions and our own filters through which we view the world. And it's important to acknowledge those filters and to challenge them.
Absolutely. So discernment, humility, critical thinking, those are all key.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I really appreciate you taking the time to unpack all of this with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. And for our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. We hope this conversation has given you some things to think about and some tools to help you navigate the complex and often confusing world of biblical prophecy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And remember, the most important thing is to approach these topics with an open mind, a discerning heart, and a willingness to seek truth wherever it may lead.
Amen to that.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. 1660.